For centuries, much of rural Britain operated under a system that placed shared custom above individual ownership. Villages were surrounded by open fields, divided into narrow strips farmed by different families. Beyond them lay common land meadows, woods, and waste where grazing animals, gathering firewood, and subsistence activities were governed by long-established rights rather than written contracts. This system was not inefficient by accident. It reflected a medieval world shaped by scarcity, seasonal risk, and collective survival. Agricultural output was modest but predictable. Social order in the countryside rested on custom, obligation, and mutual dependence, reinforced by manorial courts and local tradition. By the late medieval period, however, pressures were beginning to accumulate. Population growth, after the Black Death recovery, placed new demands on land. Wool exports expanded, drawing attention to pasture farming and profit. Landowners, particularly the gentry and aristocracy, became increasingly aware that land, reorganized and controlled, could generate far greater returns. And land was gradually redefined, not as a shared resource embedded in community life, but as an asset measurable, transferable, and what had once been negotiated through tradition increasingly passed through contracts, surveys, and parliamentary acts. The Enclosure Movement did not arrive suddenly. It emerged unevenly over centuries as an accumulation of small changes that steadily altered how land was understood and who controlled it. What followed was not simply an agricultural adjustment, but a profound reordering of rural Britain, one that reshaped landscapes, livelihoods, and social relations in ways that would echo far beyond the countryside. By the 16th century, the balance that had sustained the open field system was under strain. England's population began to rise steadily, reversing centuries of demographic stagnation. More people required more food, but the traditional methods of cultivation limited how much land could be brought into productive use. Fields lay fallow by custom. Decisions were made collectively, and innovation moved slowly. At the same time, land values increased. The growth of domestic and international markets encouraged landowners to think in terms of efficiency and profit. Wool, in particular, became a highly lucrative commodity. Pasture farming required fewer laborers and offered higher returns than arable farming, but it also required large, consolidated plots of land, something the open field system could not easily provide. Enclosing land meant removing common rights. The ability of villagers to graze animals, collect fuel, or supplement their incomes through shared resources. For smallholders and landless laborers, these rights were not marginal benefits. They were central to survival, especially during poor harvests or economic downturns. Hedges were planted, ditches dug, and access subtly restricted. In some areas, resistance followed legal disputes, local unrest, and occasional destruction of fences. The state responded unevenly, sometimes defending customary rights, at other times backing landowners' claims, and landowners increasingly turned to legislation to formalize what had once been contested on the ground. What began as scattered local adjustments was slowly moving toward a national process, backed by law and justified in the language of improvement and progress. They were systemic, driven by population growth, market forces, and shifting ideas about land itself. Enclosure was becoming not just an option, but a dominant solution to the problems of a changing rural economy. What had once occurred quietly at the edges of villages increasingly moved into formal negotiations and legal structures. Land surveys were commissioned, boundaries mapped, and customary arrangements translated into written agreements. The language of land was changing, becoming more precise and more exclusive. These early shifts were uneven across Britain. Midland counties such as Northamptonshire, Leicestershire, and Warwickshire saw enclosure advance more rapidly than others. In contrast, parts of the north and west retained open fields and common land well into the 18th century. Geography, soil quality, and local power structures all shaped the pace of change. For landowners, enclosure promised control. Consolidated fields allowed crop rotation, selective breeding, and investment in drainage and fertilization. Agricultural improvement became both an economic strategy and a cultural ideal. Landowners increasingly viewed themselves as rational managers of estates rather than custodians of customary systems. For rural communities, the experience was far more complex. Some wealthier tenant farmers benefited, gaining larger, more efficient holdings. Others were displaced entirely. Without access to common land, smallholders struggled to maintain livestock or weather poor seasons. Wage labor replaced independence, tying survival to seasonal employment rather than shared resources.
Tensions surfaced repeatedly. Riots, petitions, and legal challenges appeared wherever enclosure threatened established ways of life. One of the most famous early responses was the Midland Revolt of 1607, when villagers tore down hedges and ditches in protest. Such actions were not random disorder, but organized resistance rooted in a belief that enclosure violated moral and customary law. Despite opposition, the direction of change was clear. The legal system increasingly favored documented ownership over tradition. Economic arguments carried greater weight than social ones. By the early 18th century, enclosure was no longer an experiment. It was becoming the preferred model for those with the power to reshape the countryside. During the 18th century, enclosure shifted from a gradual tendency into a formal system. Parliament became the central mechanism through which land was reorganized. Instead of relying on local agreements or private action, landowners increasingly petitioned for Enclosure Acts laws that authorized the division and redistribution of common and open field land within specific parishes. This process followed a standardized pattern. Commissioners were appointed to survey the land, assess existing rights, and allocate parcels to individuals. Hedges, fences, and roads were laid out according to legal plans rather than tradition. Once completed, the new arrangements were permanent and enforceable by law.
And compensation for lost common rights was often inadequate or entirely absent. Smallholders and the landless rarely had the means to challenge decisions or secure meaningful allocations. What had once been shared by custom was now converted into exclusive property. The scale of this transformation was unprecedented. Between the mid-18th and early 19th centuries, thousands of enclosure acts were passed, reshaping millions of acres. The patchwork of medieval fields gave way to the rectilinear landscapes that still define much of rural England. Enclosure was justified through the language of national benefit. Advocates argued that enclosed land produced higher yields, supported a growing population, and strengthened the economy. These claims were not without foundation. Agricultural output did rise, and Britain became increasingly capable of feeding itself. Yet the system's efficiency came at a social cost. Decision-making power was centralized, participation narrowed, and rural life was reorganized around ownership rather than access. Enclosure was no longer simply about land management. It had become an instrument of structural change, embedding inequality into the physical and legal landscape of the countryside. By the early 19th century, the sheer scale of enclosure was unmistakable. An estimated 6 million acres of land in England roughly. 1/5 of the country had been enclosed through parliamentary acts. When earlier, non-parliamentary enclosures are included, the transformation was even more extensive. Entire regions were reshaped within the span of a few generations. The administrative machinery behind enclosure expanded alongside its reach. Surveys, maps, and legal records multiplied, reflecting a new obsession with measurement and precision. Land was no longer defined by memory or local knowledge, but by boundaries fixed on paper and enforced by statute. This bureaucratic clarity reinforced the permanence of change. Agricultural output did increase. Enclosed fields supported crop rotation systems, improved livestock breeding, and more intensive land use. Yields rose, and food supplies became more reliable, particularly in regions close to expanding towns. These gains helped sustain Britain's growing population during a period of rapid urban and industrial expansion. At the same time, rural employment patterns shifted. Enclosure reduced the need for labor on pasture land and undermined the subsistence strategies of small farmers. Many households that had once combined farming with common rights were pushed toward full dependence on wages. Seasonal insecurity became a defining feature of rural life. The demographic consequences were significant. Villages lost population as people moved in search of work, often toward industrializing towns. This migration did not occur all at once, but gradually, as opportunities in the countryside narrowed. Enclosure, while not the sole cause, was a powerful force accelerating the redistribution of people as well as land. The numbers tell only part of the story. Behind each surveyed acre was a reordering of daily life of work, survival, and social relations. Enclosure was not an abstract process. It was experienced through loss of access, altered routines, and a countryside that no longer operated according to shared custom. The human impact of enclosure unfolded quietly, but persistently. For those who lost access to common land, the change was immediate and practical. Livestock could no longer be grazed freely. Fuel had to be purchased rather than gathered. Supplementary food sources disappeared. What had once provided resilience in hard times was removed by law. Rural poverty became more visible and more structured. Families that had survived as smallholders or cottagers increasingly depended on parish relief or irregular employment. The Spenimland system, and later poor law reforms, reflected growing concern over rural destitution, even as the causes of that poverty were embedded in the new land system. Social relationships within villages also shifted. Enclosure reduced collective decision-making and weakened traditional obligations between neighbors. Authority moved upward, toward landlords and legal institutions, while local autonomy declined. The countryside became less communal and more hierarchical. Not all outcomes were uniform. Some tenant farmers benefited from larger, more stable holdings. Agricultural workers found employment on improved estates, though often at low wages and under strict discipline. The effects of enclosure varied by region, by class, and by timing. Cultural responses reflected this ambivalence. Poets, laborers, and observers recorded a sense of loss, not always of prosperity, but of independence and belonging. Landscapes that had once been navigated through shared understanding were now marked by barriers, signs, and legal restrictions. Enclosure did not create hardship and isolation, but it intensified existing inequalities. It narrowed the range of ways people could survive outside the wage system. In doing so, it prepared rural society for a future in which labor, rather than land, would be the primary means of subsistence for the majority. As enclosure became irreversible, rural society adapted in uneven ways. Some communities adjusted through specialization, focusing on wage, labor, seasonal migration, or niche agricultural skills. Others turned increasingly toward nearby towns, where manufacturing and construction offered alternatives to declining rural opportunities. Landowners and reformers promoted enclosure as a foundation for progress. Agricultural societies, improvement manuals, and model farms spread new techniques and standards. Efficiency, productivity, and rational management became the dominant values shaping rural policy. These ideas aligned closely with emerging industrial attitudes toward labor and organization. Resistance did not disappear, but it changed form. Large-scale riots became less frequent as legal authority hardened. Instead, opposition surfaced through petitions, local negotiation, and later, political reform movements. Enclosure fed into broader demands for representation, legal fairness, and social protection. By the early 19th century, the countryside was producing not only food, but labor. Displaced rural populations supplied the workforce for factories, mines, and urban infrastructure. Enclosure helped align rural Britain with the needs of an industrial economy. Even as it disrupted older ways of life, the adaptation was not simply economic, it was cultural. Ideas of independence shifted from access to land toward employment and wages. Security became tied to markets and institutions rather than communal rights. These changes were absorbed gradually, becoming normalized within a single lifetime. Enclosure, once controversial, faded into the background of rural administration. The hedged fields and straight roads came to seem natural, even timeless. Yet they represented a negotiated settlement between power, economy, and survival, one that redefined how land and labor would interact in modern Britain. The long-term consequences of enclosure extended far beyond agriculture. By redefining land as exclusive property, enclosure reinforced legal and economic structures that supported modern capitalism. Ownership became the central organizing principle of rural life, shaping inheritance, credit, and investment. The physical landscape bore lasting marks: the hedgerows, straightened roads, and regular field patterns introduced during enclosure still dominate much of England's countryside. These features were not merely aesthetic. They reflected a system optimized for control, productivity, and legal clarity rather than communal use. Social stratification deepened. A clearer division emerged between landowners, tenant farmers, and wage laborers. Mobility between these groups became more difficult as access to land narrowed and capital requirements increased. Rural inequality became embedded across generations. Enclosure also influenced governance. The reliance on parliamentary acts to restructure land strengthened the role of the state in economic life. It demonstrated that large-scale social change could be achieved through legislation, even when it disrupted long-standing customs. This precedent would shape later reforms in labor, industry, and welfare. Intellectually, enclosure contributed to changing ideas about progress and improvement. Efficiency and output were increasingly valued over tradition and communal stability. These assumptions carried into industrial planning, urban development, and imperial expansion. By the mid-19th century, enclosure was largely complete. Its immediate controversies faded, but its structural effects remained. The countryside had been reorganized to support a modern economy, and in the process, a centuries-old relationship between people and land had been permanently altered. By the close of the 19th century, the enclosure movement had reshaped Britain in ways both visible and subtle. Fields were neatly divided, hedgerows traced the contours of estates, and the rhythms of rural life had shifted from shared custom to individual responsibility. The transformation was not just physical, it was social, economic, and cultural. Generations who had once relied on common land adapted to new patterns of work, dependence, and mobility. E3, the impact of enclosure rippled far beyond the villages it directly touched. It laid the groundwork for industrial labor, encouraged commercial agriculture, and influenced ideas about ownership, productivity, and social order. Communities were reorganized, landscapes codified, and a country's relationship to its land fundamentally altered. In quiet reflection, the story of enclosure reveals more than just legislation or economics. It illustrates the interplay between tradition and change, between the old ways of living with the land and the emerging forces of profit, law, and modernity. It is a reminder that even seemingly simple parcels of earth can carry centuries of human decision, struggle, and adaptation. The hedgerows remain, the straightened fields persist, and the echoes of communal life, though largely gone, can still be traced in village names, local customs, and the memory embedded in the landscape. Enclosure is both an ending and a beginning, a transformation that quietly set the stage for the modern Britain that would follow.